She had 9 days. That was what her father-in-law gave her when he came through the farmhouse door on January 4th, 1881, set a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table and left without looking at her directly. 9 days to vacate the farmhouse she had lived in for 6 years, the one where she had hung curtains on the east windows and pulled 2 children through fever and croup and the kind of grinding, ordinary illness that the plains threw at small bodies like a test. And he had already taken the livestock the previous week on the legal basis that the animals were assets of the estate, not specifically hers. The temperature outside that morning was 14 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and it had not been above 0 for 11 consecutive days. Her name was Nora Torgrimsen. She was 31 years old. Her husband Otto had died of typhoid fever the previous September, 6 weeks before the first snow, and the estate he left behind was modest even by Dakota Territory standards: the farmhouse, the 40-acre homestead claim, the barn, 3 milk cows, a draft team of 2 horses, the tools, and a debt of $80 to the implement dealer in Yankton. Otto's father, Lars Torgrimsen, arrived from his own claim 12 miles south within a week of the funeral. He was, by all accounts of those who knew him, not a cruel man so much as a practical one. He had 2 unmarried sons who needed land and a farmstead to start on. The estate was technically subject to a dower, right for Nora. Under Dakota Territory statutes, she was entitled to 1/3 of the real property, but Lars had a lawyer in Yankton who knew how to make 1/3 of a seize. Marginal homestead looked like a specific parcel rather than a fractional share, and by December of 1880, the documentation had been arranged. What Nora received as her legal 1/3 was the 40 acres along the creek that nobody had ever cultivated because the slope was too steep and the floodplain was too wet, and the limestone bluff at the north end made the whole parcel essentially unplowable. Lars kept the farmhouse. Lars kept the barn and the milk cows and the draft team and the 80 acres of cultivable ground. Nora got the rocks and the creek and the hill nobody wanted. Then he came back on January 4th, set the paper down, and told her she had 9 days before the farmhouse transfer to his son was complete, and she needed to be gone. She had $4.60 in a tin behind the stove. She had 2 children, Sigrid, 8 years old, and Arne, 4. And no male relative within 300 miles who could arrive in 9 days through the worst winter Dakota Territory had seen in living memory. 9 days in January of 1,881 inches, Brule County, Dakota Territory, meant something specific. It meant 9 days in which the temperature had not risen above 0 and showed no sign of doing so. It meant 9 days in which the nearest town of any size, Yankton, 22 miles northeast across open snow-locked prairie, was functionally unreachable without a working horse team, which Lars had already taken. It meant 9 days in which the railroad supply lines had been suspended since November, and no coal was being delivered to any merchant within travelling distance, and the lumber dealers in whatever towns were still receiving goods were sold. Out of everything except full-price green-cut timber that required cash she didn't have. 9 days was not a generous offer adjusted for circumstances. It was a deadline calculated on the assumption that a widow with 2 small children and $4.60 had no realistic options and would have to go back to her own family or accept some kind of charity arrangement. Lars Torgrimsen gave her 9 days because he believed 9 days was long enough for the reality of her situation to become undeniable. He was not, in this calculation, wrong about the situation. He was wrong about what she would do with it. What she also had, though Lars had no way of knowing this and Nora herself did not fully understand it yet, was the most thermally advantageous piece of ground in Brule County. He had given her a limestone bluff and a hillside above a frozen creek, and he thought he'd left her with nothing, and he was wrong about almost everything except the legal paperwork. You need to understand what the winter of 1,880 and 1,881 actually was, because people use the word blizzard the way they use the word extraordinary casually, for things that don't deserve it, until the word loses any ability to carry the weight of what actually happened. The hard winter, which the settlers who endured it would also call the long winter, was not a single storm. It was a season that became an ordeal that became a siege. On October 15th, 1880, a blizzard arrived with almost no warning, dropping between 2 and 3 feet of snow across the northern plains in 72 hours. After that first storm, the pattern set itself: blizzard, brief thaw, blizzard, no thaw, blizzard. Each successive storm packed the previous snow harder, building ice layers under the fresh powder, creating a surface that horses could not walk through and cattle could not dig through to find the buried grass. The grasses of the northern plains, the bluestem and grummer and switchgrass that made it the finest natural grazing country in North America, went under that ice in October and did not come out until April. Cattle that could not get through the ice to the grass beneath it starved slowly, standing in their pastures, turning their backs to the wind. The railroads failed first. Snow drifted 40 feet deep in the railroad cuts across Dakota Territory, the carefully graded notches through ridges that the rail lines ran through, which in a normal winter needed a rotary plough and some effort to keep clear, but in this winter were simply impassable for weeks at a stretch. The Chicago and Northwestern suspended operations across much of the territory by November. The Northern Pacific followed. When the railroads stopped, everything stopped with them: coal, kerosene, flour, cornmeal, salt pork, lumber, medicine, letters. Communities that had relied on weekly or bi-weekly supply runs found themselves cut off from the outside world as completely as if they'd been dropped on an island. There was no telegraph message that could deliver a 100-pound sack of flour, and you had what you had when the last train ran, and that was all you were going to have until April. The Signal Corps weather station at Yankton, 22 miles northeast of Brule County, recorded some of the numbers that survived from that winter. Minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit in January, minus 32 on multiple consecutive nights. Bismarck, 200 miles north, recorded minus 45. The frost line, the depth to which freezing temperatures penetrate the soil, pushed down to 60-65, and in some parts of Dakota Territory, 72 inches. Normal frost line depth in Brule County was around 48 inches. The additional penetration was devastating because standard root cellars were typically dug to between 40 and 50 inches of depth. When the frost line pushed past 60 inches, it reached the stored vegetables and froze them solid. Potatoes turned to black mush when thawed. Carrots went soft and inedible. Families who had stocked their root cellars in the fall, expecting to eat from them all winter, opened the cellar doors in December or January to find that the ground had already taken what they'd stored there. Think about what that meant in practice. A family that had spent September and October harvesting and storing and counting their provisions had counted the sacks, calculated the weeks, added a margin for a harder-than-average winter, and felt reasonably prepared. Opened the root cellar in January to find not food, but organic rot. Whatever they had stored above ground, inside the house, was all they had left. Frame houses, the lumber-built structures that most ambitious settlers had put up as quickly as they could, because a frame house meant you were serious, meant you'd stayed, and meant you'd prospered past the dugout stage, turned out to be strikingly poor at keeping their occupants alive. The lumber was green-cut in many cases, shrinking as it dried and opening gaps at every joint and corner. A north window that had fit snugly in September gapped a 1/4 inch by December. Wind found those gaps and drove snow through them as fine as flour dust, accumulating on windowsills and in corners inside rooms where families sat by the stove. The stoves ran constantly, burning through firewood at rates that the settlers had not calculated for, because their calculations had been based on a normal winter. A standard iron cookstove of the type most settlers used in 1880 could put out roughly 10 to 14,000 BTUs per hour at a good burn rate, but a one-room frame house in minus 25-degree weather built from 1-inch green lumber without insulation, was losing heat through every surface simultaneously. The heat loss through an uninsulated inch-thick wood wall on a calm night at -25 is roughly 5 BTUs per hour per square foot of wall surface. A modest 16 by 20 foot one-room cabin has roughly 600 square feet of wall and ceiling area. At -25 outside and 50 degrees inside, a 75-degree differential, the heat loss through that wall area alone runs close to 4,500 BTUs per hour just from conduction through the wood. Add heat loss through the floor, through every gap in the chinking, through the single-pane glass windows, through the door frame, and a stove putting out 12,000 BTUs per hour could barely maintain 50 degrees inside on a calm day. In a wind, with the frame gaps acting as intake vents for the wind-driven pressure differential, the losses were much worse. Families who ran through their firewood burned fence rails. Families who ran through fence rails burned interior doors and then door frames, and then whatever furniture could be disassembled and fed through the firebox without smothering the flame. Some families burned down to the floor joists before the winter ended. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who was 13 that winter and living in De Smet, 40 miles north of where Nora stood on the morning of January 4th, described the experience in a book she would not finish until she was in her 70s. The exhaustion and the cold and the monotony and the grinding anxiety of not knowing when the coal supply might be restored or the trains begin, running again. In De Smet they ground seed wheat in hand-cranked coffee mills to make flour, rationing the output to keep the calories above starvation level. In De Smet, at least, there was a town, some collective structure of social organisation, the ability to share information and sometimes resources, neighbours who knew where other neighbours were. In Brule County, the homestead claims were spread across the landscape at distances of 1/2 mile to 2 miles, and in a blizzard, 1/2 mile was effectively infinity. Families survived or didn't largely on their own, and this was the winter that Nora Torgrimsen was about to face with $4.60, 2 children, 9 days, and a limestone hillside. Her father-in-law had handed her the legal paperwork and the worst land on the property and walked back out the door, and she had stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse she was about to lose and counted $4.60 and decided what to do with it. The answer she came up with after one night's thinking, after a morning's walk, was a spade. She didn't spend the first day after Lars left crying. She spent it outside. Sigrid was capable of watching Arn for a few hours, and the stove had been banked, and there was enough cornmeal for porridge when she returned, and Nora dressed in everything she owned, 3 wool skirts layered, Otto's canvas coat over her own wool one, her good boots with extra rags stuffed around her feet, and she went to look at what she had. The 40 acres included about 6 acres of creek bottom that flooded every April without fail, about 28 acres of slope that varied from gently inclined to nearly vertical, where the limestone bluff pushed out of the hillside, and about 6 acres of essentially flat ground at the top of the bluff that might have been farmable if anyone could get equipment up there, which they couldn't. The bluff itself was a particular feature, a south-facing limestone outcrop, roughly 140 feet wide, and between 25 and 40 feet high, running east-west along the north edge of the property. She walked the creek bottom first and felt the cold there immediately. It was sharper than on the open ground she'd crossed to get there. She could not have explained why at the time she would not have known what cold air drainage was, or that cold air is denser than warm air and flows downhill and accumulates in valley bottoms the way water does, or that on a clear, windless night, the temperature differential between a low spot and a mid-slope position, 20 feet above it, can run between 5 and 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and in severe cold events can reach 15 to 20. She felt it though. She felt the way the cold at the creek bottom was a different quality of cold than the cold on the slope, heavier, wetter against her face, more penetrating through the layers of wool and canvas. She climbed the slope. Partway up the south face of the bluff, the limestone flattened into a narrow shelf about 4 feet wide and 12 feet long, a natural bench in the rock face, sheltered from above by the overhang of the bluff top, and from the west by a spur of rock that jutted out like a partial wall. She stood on that shelf, and the wind, which had been consistent and bitter on the open ground below, was noticeably reduced. The bluff mass absorbed it, deflected it, split it to go over the top or around the east side. On the shelf itself, the air was calm enough that she could feel the warmth of the January sun on the south-facing stone under her boots. The problem she had was simple in its outline and brutal in its specifics. She needed a shelter capable of keeping 2 children alive through the worst winter in Dakota Territory history, and she had 8 days to build it, 0 money for lumber, and no male help she could count on. Standard solutions were unavailable. A sod house, the traditional fallback for settlers who couldn't afford lumber, normally took a week to 2 weeks with help and required sod-cutting equipment she didn't have access to. A standard dugout into flat ground was feasible physically, but presented flooding problems with the Spring Creek rise. She'd seen dugouts flooded out in previous springs by neighbours who hadn't planned for the April melt. The bluff was different. The bluff offered something a flat-ground dugout didn't, a pre-existing massive structure of stone and earth that would form 3 walls and a roof without her building them. If she excavated into the hillside just below the limestone shelf, the bluff itself would be the back wall, the ceiling on the north half, and most of both side walls. She wouldn't be building a shelter as much as revealing one that was already there, removing the material between herself and the warm core of the hill. She spent another hour on the slope, kicking at the soil with her boot heel, testing the rock face with the heel of her palm for consistency and integrity, looking at the angle of the sun and the direction the wind came from when it wasn't blocked by the bluff. Then she went back to the farmhouse and wrote a letter to the Engebretsen family 1/2 mile north, asking for a spade and a pickaxe. Jorgen Engebretsen was 61 years old, a Norwegian immigrant who had come to Dakota Territory in 1876 with his wife Marta, 4 children, and 17 years of farm labour experience in Telemark. He had built a frame house on his claim, because that was what you did in 1876 when you had the capital and the ambition, and he had lived in it through 4 winters, each of which had been progressively more difficult to heat as the green lumber dried and warped, and the gaps opened, and the wind found its way in. The winter of 1880 to 1881 was treating him badly. They'd burned through almost 2 cords of wood in November alone, which was double what he'd used in any previous November, and the woodpile was visibly shrinking faster than he'd planned for. He arrived the next morning with his son Bjorn, who was 16 and strong, and both tools. They stood at the base of the bluff where Nora met them, and Jorgen looked up at the limestone face and said what any sensible man with 60 years of practical experience would say. "There's no room for a house there. It's rock." "I'm not building a house," Nora said. "I'm digging one." Bjorn didn't say anything. He was looking at the shelf on the south face with the expression of someone doing calculations they hadn't been asked to do out loud. Jorgen argued for most of that first morning, not cruelly, but genuinely. He pointed out that the limestone would resist the pickaxe, that the ceiling might not hold without proper timber support, that a hillside shelter was harder to ventilate than a surface structure, and the smoke from the cook stove would become a serious problem. These were all legitimate objections, and Nora acknowledged every one of them. She had answers for most, partial answers for the rest, and for the few she didn't have answers to, she simply said she would figure it out as she went. He watched her pick the exact spot, not on the shelf but 8 feet below it, where the limestone face gave way to the softer, clay-heavy earth that formed the hillside's outer layer. She drove the spade into it, and it went in more easily than either Jorgen or Bjorn had expected. Below the thin freeze layer at the surface, the soil was workable. "The rock is the ceiling," Nora said, looking up. "I don't need to build what's already there." They worked in shifts, one digging, one moving spoil down the slope and scattering it toward the creek bottom. Nora established the dimensions with stakes and a length of cord on the first day, 14 feet across the south face, 16 feet back into the hill, and she wanted 7 feet of headroom at the center line, which meant the excavation would go back and up at an angle before leveling out. She had thought about this specifically. If the floor was level but the slope continued behind it, the deepest part of the excavation, the back wall, would be at the greatest depth below the hillside surface, which meant the greatest depth of earth and rock above and behind it, which meant the maximum thermal mass between herself and the surface cold. The digging was the hardest physical work of Nora's life, including childbirth, and she'd had a difficult time with Arn. The topsoil layer was 6 inches of frozen crust that the pickaxe had to crack first before the spade could follow. Below the freeze, the clay was stiff and heavy. Each full spade load weighed somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds, and moving that weight up out of the excavation as it deepened required rigging a simple pulley system on the second day, using a rope slung over a protruding limestone spur above the entrance. Bjorn managed the rope. Nora dug. Jorgen moved the spoil. By the end of the first day, they had the entrance cut roughly 6 feet wide, 5 feet tall, going back 4 feet into the hill to a point where the natural limestone ceiling above the shelf began. By the end of the second day, the main cavity was taking shape, wider, taller, the clay coming away in large, dense chunks that Bjorn pulled up the rope and pail system faster than Nora could fill the bucket. She noticed on the second day something she'd expected, but hadn't been completely sure of until she felt it. The clay below the initial freeze layer was warm. Not warm the way a heated room is warm, warm the way bread dough left by the fire is warm, a faint internal temperature that had nothing to do with the current air. The earth at 3 feet of depth in January of 1881 held residual warmth from the previous summer because soil and rock don't change temperature quickly, they resist change. They are, in the language of modern thermal engineering, a massive thermal flywheel. Ground temperature at depth is governed by 2 things: the geothermal gradient, which is heat rising from the Earth's interior at a constant rate regardless of what happens on the surface, and the soil's thermal diffusivity, which determines how fast surface temperature changes penetrate downward. In Brule County, at a depth of 6 feet, the soil temperature in January ran between 45 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the hard winter. When the frost line had pushed deeper than normal, the temperature at 6 feet was still above freezing. At 8 feet it was warmer still. The limestone bluff, which had been absorbing summer solar radiation for months and losing it only slowly since October, was radiating that stored heat into the space of the excavation at roughly 50 degrees, constantly, silently, for free. The air outside the shelter, during the worst nights of January and February 1881, was running between -28 and -35 degrees Fahrenheit. The back wall of Nora's shelter, solid limestone at depth, was running at approximately 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature differential between the back wall and the outside air was more than 80 degrees. That wall was not just blocking the cold. It was actively adding warmth to the space, the way a very gentle fire would, except it required no wood and would not go out. By the end of the 4th day, the main cavity was complete, 14 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the hill, 6 feet tall at the center line. The limestone bluff formed the ceiling and the back wall. The excavated clay faces formed the east and west walls. The south opening the front face was still open to the elements, which was the most urgent problem to solve before anything else. Bjorn Engebretsen went home on the 4th evening at his father's instruction. From that point, Nora worked the days alone, while Sigrid managed Arn in the farmhouse, still technically available to them for 4 more days, and she drove herself harder than was probably medically advisable, because the alternative was worse. The roof took 2 full days, and was the most technically demanding part of the project. She had identified 8 cottonwood trees along the creek bottom that were straight enough and large enough, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, to span the 14-foot width of the opening as rafters. Getting them up to the shelter level was the problem. She cut them with Otto's axe, then spent the better part of a day on each one, dragging them up the slope through 2 feet of snow with a rope around her waist, resting every 20 yards, her boots finding purchase on the limestone outcroppings when the snow gave way. She moved all 8 trees in a day and a half. The rafters went across the opening at roughly 18-inch spacing. Resting at their north ends on a notch, she cut in the limestone lip of the bluff ceiling, and at their south ends on the top of the front wall cottonwood posts she'd set in the ground. Across the rafters she laid willow branches cut from the creek, packed as close together as she could get them. Over the willow she spread the dry prairie grass she'd collected from the windward faces of the bluff where the snow hadn't packed it solid, a deep layer, 8 to 10 inches of loose, dry, dead grass. The prairie grass had an R value of roughly 1.5 to 2 per inch when dry and loose, not as good as modern fiberglass bat, but real and measurable. 8 inches of dry prairie grass over the rafters contributed somewhere between R12 and R16 to the roof assembly. Over the grass she laid 2 layers of sod, the buffalo grass sod of the Dakota Prairie. The root systems of bluestem and grama and switchgrass woven together into a mat roughly 3 inches thick. That was the closest thing to natural building material the treeless plains offered. She cut the bricks roughly 12 inches by 24, using the spade's edge, each one weighing 40 to 50 pounds. She laid them grass side down on the roof in the Norwegian way, 2 offset courses, each brick lapping over the joint below, so the finished sod layer was 6 inches thick across the full roof span. The finished roof assembly from inside to outside was cottonwood rafter, willow weave, 8 inches of loose prairie grass, 6 inches of sod in 2 courses. The combined R value of the organic materials alone, conservatively estimated, ran between R20 and R26. Because the roof was flat, essentially at grade with the hillside slope above it, snow would not slide off. It would accumulate. Dry snow on the northern plains in January and February runs roughly R1 per inch. By the end of January, the roof carried 6 to 8 inches of new snow, adding R6 to R8. By February, with drifting and consolidation, the snow cover on the sod roof reached 20 to 24 inches in depth, adding R20 to R24 to the assembly. By the worst nights of February, the total roof insulation value was running between R44 and R50. No timber frame building in Brule County was insulated to R10 because there was nothing to insulate with. The front wall went up on day 7. Nora built it from limestone she'd been collecting and stacking at the bottom of the bluff for 4 days. The flat creek bottom slabs, varying from 2 to 6 inches thick, that she moved up the slope 1 armload at a time. She laid them dry, no mortar, because she had no lime and no time in the old Norse dry stacking method she'd seen in her grandfather's outbuildings in Norway as a girl. The heavier pieces at the base, each course slightly set back from the one below for stability. The gaps chinked with smaller stones pressed in with a stick, and then sealed with handfuls of wet clay packed hard. The clay would freeze and become as firm as mortar. She left the door opening in the centre of the wall 30 inches wide, just wide enough for a person carrying something, and 5 feet tall, framed with 2 vertical cottonwood logs set in the clay floor and a cottonwood lintel across the top. For the door itself, she used the buffalo robe from the bedroom of the farmhouse, a heavy, dense, double-thickness winter robe that hung over the opening and pressed flat against the stone face when the wind came from the southwest. which it usually did. A buffalo robe has no R value to speak of in the conventional sense, but its air impermeability is nearly total. It doesn't let wind drive through it the way a poorly fitted wooden door can let wind through its gaps. She also cut one window opening in the east section of the stone wall, 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall, and stretched a piece of scraped and greased rawhide across a cottonwood frame to fill it. The rawhide let in grey filtered light on clear days and cut the wind completely. The entrance was designed with one specific physics principle in mind, though Nora would not have used those words. She had seen Mandan earth lodges when she and Otto visited Fort Abraham Lincoln in 1877. The Mandan entrance passages were not level with the lodge floor, they were cut lower, so that a person entering had to step down into the passage and then step up into the lodge. The Mandan people had worked out over 4 centuries of Dakota winters what atmospheric scientists would confirm much later in formal research. Cold air is denser than warm air. It flows low and settles in low spots, and an entrance that forces incoming air to drop before it rises creates a cold trap. The heavy, cold air tumbles down into the entrance depression and cannot easily flow up and over the step into the living space above. Nora cut her entrance 3 steps down from the shelter floor, 3 rough limestone steps that descended about 18 inches total before the floor of the entrance passage, and then back up the same 18 inches through, the door opening into the main chamber. Cold air entering through the buffalo robe would fall into the step, depression, and largely stay there, and every time the door opened, some cold spilled in, but it was a trickle compared to what it would have been with a level entrance. On the 8th day, January 12th, 1881, the last day before the farmhouse transfer made her presence there illegal, Nora Torgrimsen moved everything she owned into the hillside shelter. The iron cook stove, which the Engebretsen men came back to help carry up the slope on a sled of green cottonwood planks, went against the limestone back wall, with its pipe run through a clay-sealed hole in the sod roof. The 4 burlap sacks of cornmeal, totaling 140 pounds, went along the west wall. The 22 pounds of salt pork went on a high shelf she'd carved into the clay wall. The crate of 12 laying hens went into the northeast corner and got a burlap cover. The sleeping platform, an earthen bench raised 18 inches off the floor along the east wall, covered with both wool blankets, went in, and Arne climbed up on it immediately and declared it satisfactory, which it was. That first night Nora did not sleep. She sat on a 3-legged stool near the stove, watching the fire, listening to the children breathe, listening to the wind work over the bluff top above. She checked the thermometer at midnight, at 2 in the morning, at 4. The minimum reading of that first night was 44 degrees Fahrenheit, recorded at 3:15 in the morning when the fire had been banked for 2 hours, and the shelter was running entirely on the warmth of the stove mass, the limestone walls, her own body, and 12 hens. Outside, that same night, the Signal Corps station at Yankton recorded minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The number that matters is not 44. The number is 72, the gap between minus 28 outside and 44 inside. 72 degrees of thermal separation maintained by a structure built in 8 days with a borrowed spade and a pickaxe for 80 cents of materials. Every frame house within 10 miles of that bluff, burning wood they'd been buying for months, was struggling to maintain a 40 or 50 degree differential. Some weren't making it. Some families were sitting in 40-degree kitchens in January of 1881, burning their furniture. 44 degrees inside is cold by modern standards, and sleeping in 44 degrees for a winter is something you remember. But it is not death. It is not minus 10, which would be death for children in one night. 44 degrees is uncomfortable and survivable. And as the stove ran through the morning and the sun came over the bluff top and struck the south-facing stone wall at the front of the shelter, the temperature climbed. By midday, on clear days, the shelter ran close to 60 degrees. The children were warm. The hens were laying less than in summer, as hens do in the short days of January, but laying and the eggs added protein to the cornmeal diet that would otherwise have been monotonous to the point of causing deficiency problems over a long winter. Nora made a fire only in the mornings and evenings, burning cottonwood scraps and twisted prairie hay in a slow feed, and she found by the end of the first week that she was using approximately 1/3 the fuel she would have needed to hold even a modest frame house livable under the same conditions. The limestone and clay around her were doing the other 2/3 of the work, silently, continuously, pulling no draught and burning no wood. There was something else she noticed in those first days that she would have had no framework to explain, though it is simply the physics of dense material responding to heat input. In a frame house, when you built a fire in the stove, the room warmed quickly 20 minutes, and you could feel it. When the fire died, the room cooled almost as quickly. The thin wood walls had no thermal capacity to speak of. They couldn't store warmth, and they couldn't release it. The temperature tracked the fire almost in real time, which meant the fire had to run constantly just to maintain conditions, and any interruption overnight when the fire was banked, or in a blizzard, when the woodpile was briefly inaccessible, registered immediately as danger. In the bluff shelter, the response was completely different. When she built the morning fire, the room warmed slowly, slower than a frame house, because the clay walls and the limestone back wall were absorbing the heat rather than reflecting it. But when the fire was banked at midday and again in the evening, the temperature in the shelter dropped slowly too. The clay and limestone were releasing back what they'd absorbed, steadily, for hours after the fire went out. Nora's thermometer showed the shelter losing perhaps 2 to 3 degrees per hour through the overnight, with the fire banked. Compared to the 10 to 15 degrees per hour she would have seen in a frame house of the same size. The dense material was acting as a heat storage system, not a sophisticated one, not a designed one, but a real one. It took what the small fire gave it and paid it back slowly through the long night. By the end of the first week, Nora Torgrimsen, 4 years old, had developed a daily routine of climbing to the top of the sleeping platform with his wooden horse and conducting what appeared to be a serious agricultural operation on the clay surface of the platform wall beside him, using a stick as a plough. Sigrid was teaching herself long division from a primer she'd carried from the farmhouse. The hens produced 3 eggs on the 4th day, 4 on the 5th. On the 6th morning, Nora opened the buffalo robe door for the first time in 2 days to let some air through, and the cold that came in hit her like a physical object. It was 22 below outside, and inside it was 53. The differential across a buffalo robe and a limestone wall was 75 degrees. She let it stay open for 10 minutes, watched the thermometer drop to 48, and closed it again. Within 40 minutes, with no fire, the shelter was back to 52. That was the thermal mass releasing what it had stored, the physics working the way it was supposed to work. On January 15th, Jörgen Engebretsen came back to check on her. He stood at the bottom of the entrance steps and looked in, and did not say anything for a long moment. Sigrid was doing her arithmetic on a slate. Arn was on the sleeping platform with his wooden horse. The stove had a small fire. The hens made the particular low murmuring sound that hens make when they're calm and the temperature is acceptable. "How cold does it get in here at night?" he said. 44 was the coldest, 3 nights ago. He thought about that. It was 23 below that night. I know. Marta can't keep the kitchen above 45. We've burned through close to 3 cords since October. There was a silence. Outside, the wind was moving. Inside the shelter, it was barely audible. "There's room," Nora said, "if it comes to that." He went back that afternoon. He came back the next morning, January 16th, with Marta and all 4 of the Engebretsen children, the youngest 4, the oldest 16, and a second iron stove, and 6 more sacks of cornmeal, and 6 additional chickens in a wooden crate. The east extension took 3 days. Jorgen and Bjorn dug it out 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the bluff on the east side of the main chamber, connected through an arched opening cut with the pickaxe. The clay came out more easily here because they'd found a seam of looser soil between 2 limestone strata, more creek stone for the expanded front wall section, more sod for the additional roof. The second stove went in the east extension against the new back wall. The sleeping platform extended the full east wall length, 14 feet total, which could accommodate all 4 Engebretsen children sleeping side by side with room to spare. 9 people in the shelter now: Nora, Sigrid, Arn, Jorgen, Marta, and 4 children. 2 stoves, 18 hens and chickens combined, 9 bodies. The combined heat output of 9 people at rest runs roughly 4,500 to 5,000 BTUs per hour. The chickens contributed perhaps 150 to 200 BTUs per hour combined. Each stove, running on cottonwood at a modest rate, added 4,000 to 6,000 BTUs. The limestone and clay walls, radiating at 48 to 52 degrees into a space trying to hold between 50 and 60 degrees, were effectively base heating the space rather than draining it. The shelter ran warmer with 9 people than it had with 3, and Nora had to open the buffalo robe door for 20 minutes each morning to let the temperature down a bit before she banked the fires. On January 23rd, Astrid Knudsen arrived. She scratched on the stone wall at 10 in the morning because she didn't have the strength to knock. Nora pulled back the buffalo robe to find Astrid Knudsen standing in the entrance with all 3 of her children, the 9-year-old, the 6-year-old, and the 2-year-old, who was wrapped in Astrid's coat, while Astrid wore only a wool dress and a shawl against -20 degrees. They had walked half a mile from the Knudsen frame house. Astrid's face was grey-white in the pattern that indicates early frostbite on the cheeks and nose. Her husband Peder had sent her ahead while he stayed to try to save the livestock. The Knudsens' situation was what happened when a frame house in 1881 ran out of options. They'd finished the firewood on January 18th. After that, Peder had burned the kitchen table, the 2 spare chairs, the bedroom door, and the frame of one of the children's beds. On the morning of January 23rd, he'd started on the interior window casings. The house temperature at noon that day, with a fire going, was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The overnight low inside had been 22. Nora brought all 4 of them in and sat them close to the east extension stove and gave them hot cornmeal mush with a little salt and a little of the remaining tallow worked in for calories, and she did not say anything about what they had or hadn't done to prepare for the winter, because that was not useful information now. Marta Engebretsen took the baby and held it against her chest under her coat. Bjorn went out to look for Peder Knudsen. He found him at the barn trying to get the 2 remaining cattle out before their water froze. Peder Knudsen was a big man, 35, with the particular kind of stubbornness that had gotten him to Dakota Territory in the first place, and that had also prevented him from accepting that his frame house was going to kill his family. He argued with Bjorn for 20 minutes before the cold finished the argument, and he followed the boy up to the bluff. The north extension took 4 days harder rock, a limestone intrusion that required the pickaxe for most of the lateral face, and a change in direction that meant running the extension northeast to follow the softer clay seam rather than straight north as originally planned. 10 feet wide, 10 feet of depth into the bluff, arched ceiling connection into the main chamber. Peder Knudsen and Bjorn dug. Jorgen moved spoil. Nora kept the fires going and managed the food stores and the children. The 2 Knudsen cattle went into the north extension on January 28th. There was nowhere else to put them. The Knudsen barn was losing its siding to the fire and would not hold livestock much longer. Getting 2 full-grown dairy cattle up a hillside in January is not a dignified process, but Peder Knudsen and Jorgen Engebretsen accomplished it with a rope and patience and language that the children were asked to ignore. A dairy cow, generates between 500 and 1500 BTUs of body heat per hour, depending on size and metabolic activity. 2 dairy cows in an enclosed space add somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 BTUs per hour to the shelter's heat budget, continuously, whether anyone feeds the stove or not. The north extension, after the cattle arrived, ran warm enough that the Knutsen children moved their sleeping pallets in there despite the smell. Because the smell was acceptable and the temperature was genuinely warm, consistently 55 to 60 degrees, even overnight without any fire. The full shelter in its final configuration housed 13 people across 3 chambers: the main chamber, the east extension, and the north extension. The total floor area was approximately 500 square feet. 3 stoves, though the north extension stove ran only a few hours a day after the cattle arrived because it didn't need to run more. 24 hens and chickens, 2 dairy cows, 13 human bodies, the limestone bluff wrapping around on 3 sides at 50 degrees, the snow-loaded sod roof at R44 or better, the cold trap entrance keeping the main chamber protected from every door opening. The temperature in the main chamber through all of February 1881 measured between 48 and 62 degrees Fahrenheit on the thermometer. Nora kept hanging from a cottonwood rafter peg. Outside, during that same period, the Yankton Signal Corps station recorded lows of -28, -31, -33, and on one night in mid-February, -37 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars Torgrimsen came on February 12th. He had burned through his woodpile by February 7th, 5 days earlier. Since then he'd burned 2 sections of fence rail, the boards from the south face of the barn, and the grain storage room door from the barn interior. His second milk cow had died in the barn on February 9th, lying down in her stall and not getting up, killed by cold that had penetrated the barn walls after he removed the insulating siding boards to burn them. His remaining cow was alive, but standing in a temperature the thermometer in the barn registered at 18 degrees Fahrenheit. What Lars had done, without knowing the physics of it, was commit the same error almost every frame house settler committed that winter. He had treated his barn's insulation as a dispensable resource rather than recognizing what it actually was. The south-facing barn siding boards were doing exactly what wall insulation does. They were slowing the transfer of heat from the barn interior to the exterior air. When he pulled them off to burn them, he was removing his insulation to fuel his stove, which was a trade with an obvious and brutal end point. The barn went from borderline survivable to genuinely lethal for the cattle within days of the first boards coming down. Each board removed accelerated the heat loss, which required more burning, which removed more boards, until there was nothing left on the south wall but the structural members. He walked 2 miles across the open prairie in -20 degrees. He found the bluff. He stood outside the stone wall and knocked on the cottonwood doorframe with a gloved fist. Nora pulled back the buffalo robe and looked at him. He was 63 years old, a practical man who had built things and lost things and worked land in 2 countries, and he had never in his life asked for help from someone he had wronged. He stood in the entrance for a moment without speaking, and she could see in the set of his shoulders that the walk had taken most of what he had. "I was wrong about the land," he said. She stepped back from the entrance without answering, and he came in. He stood in the main chamber and looked around. He had come expecting something desperate and squalid, the refuge of a woman who had failed, evidence of exactly the primitive destitution he'd assumed when he handed her the paper in January. What he found was 13 people in a warm, organized space. Marta Engebretsen mending a boot at the small table by the east stove. The Knutsen children asleep on their pallets in the north extension, the warmest chamber now that the cattle were in there. Sigrid doing her arithmetic on the slate she'd carried from the farmhouse. Arn on the sleeping platform with the wooden horse he'd brought from the farm and refused to leave behind. The thermometer on its rafter, peg reading 54 degrees Fahrenheit at midday on February 12th, while his barn had registered 18. He said nothing for a long time. Nora poured him coffee, not chicory. Real coffee from the small supply she'd been rationing, and handed it to him, and he held the cup with both hands, the way you hold something warm when you've been cold for too long. He stayed 3 nights. On the second day, he went back to the farmhouse for the remaining milk cow, the one that was still alive. Barely. And Bjorn Engebretsen and Peder Knutsen walked with him, and they brought the animal up the hillside with a rope and a great deal of patience, and some words that the children were asked to ignore. She went into the north extension beside the Knutsen cattle. Lars slept on the main chamber floor near the cook stove with a borrowed blanket, and during those 3 days Nora noticed consistently that he took less than his share when the food went around. He ate after the children every time, and he left what remained on the communal plate without comment. It was the only thing he could do that said what he couldn't say in words, and she understood it for what it was. On the morning he left, the weather had lifted enough that the roads were passable, and the farmhouse, with its fire rebuilt, he would hold livable temperatures. He stood at the entrance with his coat on and looked back one last time at the interior of the shelter. "Your father taught you this?" he said. "Nobody taught me," Nora said. "The hill taught me." He nodded once and walked out and crossed the slope and went around the bluff onto the open ground heading south. She pulled the buffalo robe across the entrance and went to bank the morning fire and did not watch him go. Both of his remaining cattle tell the whole story of that winter in one sentence. The cow that came to the hillside lived. The cow that stayed in the stripped barn did not. The long winter broke in the first week of April, 1881. The thaw came fast, the way it always does on the northern plains, not a gradual warming but a sudden shift, 3 days of south wind carrying something different from the north wind that had run for 5 months, and the snow that had been packed solid since October began moving. The Missouri River ice went out in a violent surge that tore the banks and sent water across the bottomlands for miles. Nora's Creek flooded, as it flooded every April, and rose to within 6 feet of the shelter entrance before it peaked and began receding. The shelter stayed dry, the sod roof held. The limestone bluff walls were impervious to water in the way only solid rock is impervious. When she climbed to the entrance on the peak flood day, the clay floor of the main chamber was dry. The entrance passage had a few inches of mud at the bottom from surface runoff sheeting down the hillside, and she scooped it out with a flat stone and refilled the low spots with fresh clay, and it was done in an hour. The flat creek bottom acres, the 6 acres of floodplain that Nora Torgrimsen had always cited as proof that the land was worthless, went under water for 12 days. When they came back out, they were covered in 4 inches of creek silt, the fine organic deposit that prairie floodplains have been accumulating from successive floods for centuries. The fertility of bottomland creek soil is not an accident. It's the record of every flood that ever covered it. Nora planted beans along the creek margin that summer, and they grew so far above what her neighbours' higher ground plantings produced that people started asking her what she'd done to the soil. She hadn't done anything to it. She just paid attention to what it already was. She filed her homestead claim on the 40 acres in April, under the Homestead Act provision allowing single women to file in their own names. The Yankton Land Office clerk entered it without comment. Single women filing claims were common enough in Dakota Territory, where roughly 20 to 25% of all homestead entries were made by women acting alone, many of them widows with children who had arrived at the frontier with the same absence of options and found the same practical ingenuity that the situation demanded. The 5-year prove-up clock started. She did not tear the shelter down. That summer she built a proper sod house on the flat ground above the creek bank real window frames, a plank door on iron hinges, a proper iron stove with a clay-daubed chimney, and she built it well and was glad to have it. But she kept the hillside structure maintained as what she called the winter room, repointing the clay chinking each fall before the first hard freeze. checking the sod roof for gaps that might let water through in spring, keeping the entrance passage cleared of debris. Her neighbours thought this was eccentric behaviour for a woman who had a real house now. She knew what February felt like from both sides of that comparison, and she knew which one she would want if the hard winter came again. She proved up in April 1886, received her patent in June, and began the longer, quieter work of making a going concern out of 40 acres that everyone except her had written off. By 1891 she had saved enough for a frame addition onto the sod house. 2 rooms, milled lumber, glass windows in proper frames. She built it well, and by then she had enough history with the land to anticipate the problems the frame addition would create in winter and address most of them before they appeared. The north-facing wall got an extra layer of clay plaster inside and out, applied before the weather turned. The window openings got interior storm shutters she could close at night. The floor got a canvas underlayer before the planks went down. None of it was expensive. All of it came from the knowledge of what cold does when you ignore it. The Engebretsen family stayed. Jorgen Engebretsen built a new farmhouse on the south slope of his claim in 1882, and he built it with the memory of February 1881 clear in mind. A half dugout. The back half excavated 3 feet into the hillside, sod walls 2 feet thick above grade, a full 18-inch sod roof over cottonwood rafters, a south-facing glass window to catch winter sun, and the entrance on the southeast corner where the prevailing northwest wind couldn't find it directly. He placed it on the mid-slope above the low ground where he'd watched Cold Pool on clear nights, below the ridge where the wind hit hardest. He lived in it for 22 years and told anyone who asked that he'd never once run short of fuel while living there. When his son Bjorn built his own claim house in 1888, Bjorn built a half dugout too. It was not the respectable choice. It was the one that worked. Peder Knutsen left for Minnesota in May of 1881 and did not come back to Dakota Territory. Whatever confidence he'd had in his ability to read a Dakota winter correctly had not recovered from January 23rd through February 28th of 1881, which he spent in a hillside shelter while his frame house sat empty half a mile away with its door casing stripped for the fire. He and Astrid wrote twice in the first year, and then correspondence stopped, which was common for frontier families who had decided that looking backward at a place they'd left was not useful. Lars Torgrimsen died in 1886 at age 68. The farmhouse, the one he had taken from Nora, the one she had sewn the curtains for and scraped ice from the hinges of and raised 2 children in, had been sold at auction to cover debts the previous year. The buyer was a German family with enough capital to pay a fair price for an established farmstead. In the Brule County Recorder's office, the 40-acre parcel on the limestone bluff remained in the Torgrimsen name through several subsequent transfers into the 1930s. At some point between the surveys, someone with access to the original plat notes added a margin notation beside the property description. Limestone bluff, south exposure, creek drainage. It wasn't an appraisal, it was a description. But the person who wrote it understood what made that particular strip of worthless ground worth describing carefully. There's a thing worth saying about why the settlers of 1881 kept building the structures that were failing them. Because it wasn't stupidity, and it wasn't ignorance in the simple sense. It was something more complicated, and it's worth sitting with, because the same pattern shows up in every era, and the people caught in it are rarely fools. Lumber was legible. You could buy it at a known price, measure it by the board foot, stack it, and compare your pile to a neighbour's pile, and understand exactly where you stood relative to each other. A frame house announced itself to anyone who rode past it as evidence of seriousness, of investment, of a family that had arrived and intended to stay. It was the visible record of a claim staked not just on paper but in the landscape. A dugout or a hillside shelter announced exactly the opposite, that you were one step from the ground, that you had not yet progressed past the most basic and primitive condition, that whatever prosperity you'd aimed at when you filed the claim had not yet materialized in any form you could show anyone. Mattie Oblinger, who homesteaded in Fillmore County, Nebraska, in 1873 and left 318 letters surviving in the Library of Congress, described settlers abandoning their cold frame houses to build sod structures for the winter, and noted that this was understood in the community as a step backward, even though the sod houses were dramatically warmer. The social signal of the building material ran in exactly the opposite direction from its thermal performance. The thing that said, "I have arrived," was the thing that was freezing people. The thing that said, "I have failed," was the thing that was keeping them alive. The earth didn't care about any of that. The ground at 6 feet in Brule County, Dakota Territory, ran at 48 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit through January of 1881, and it ran there whether anyone respected it or not. The thermal belt on the mid-slope of the limestone bluff was 8 to 12 degrees warmer than the creek bottom on clear, cold nights, and it was warmer regardless of whether anyone measured it. The sod roof carried R44 by February, and it was R44 whether or not the county assessor gave it any credit. The physics of cold air density and slope positioning and thermal mass and geothermal buffering operate on the same terms, whether the people living inside them understand those terms or not. The Mandan people of the northern plains had understood all of this for 4 centuries before any of the 1,881 settlers arrived. The Mandan Earth Lodge, a large, partially buried, dome-roofed structure of earth and timber, capable of housing an extended family and sometimes their horses through the severest northern plains winters, incorporated the same physics. Nora applied to the bluff shelter, earth mass for geothermal buffering, slope or elevated positioning to avoid cold air drainage, downward sloping entrance passages acting as cold traps, and a central fire positioned so that convective heat rose to where people slept on the raised interior platforms. This was not primitive design in any useful sense of the word. It was the product of 400 years of iterative improvement in exactly the conditions that killed settlers in 1881. Lewis and Clark spent the winter of 1804 and 1805 at Fort Mandan, their timber frame structure, and their journals record the cold and the fuel consumption and the difficulty of keeping the fort at livable temperatures. The Mandan villages around Fort Mandan, in their earth lodges, maintained warmth that the expedition members noticed and commented on. They visited the lodges regularly in the evenings, partly for the sociability and partly because the lodges were warm in a way Fort Mandan was not. No one at Fort Mandan seems to have seriously considered building differently. The knowledge was available, literally visible from the fort walls on any day without a blizzard. It remained invisible as practical engineering because it came from the wrong source, and because the men who designed Fort Mandan had been trained in a tradition of military fortification that did not include earth lodges as a category. Nora Torgrimsen had no such tradition to limit her. She had nothing, which turned out to be the specific condition that opens a person to the physics the ground is offering, rather than the physics the lumber dealer is selling. The physics that Nora used in 1881 did not disappear with the frontier. It went dormant for most of a century in the United States, suppressed by cheap fuel, by the cultural prestige of conventional frame construction, by the mass production of lumber that made it the obvious and affordable choice for almost 100 years. It resurfaced in academic literature on passive solar and earth-sheltered design in the 1940s and 1950s, became briefly popular during the oil crisis of the early 1970s, when the price of heating fuel tripled in 2 years, and suddenly made people interested in whether a house could be heated with something other than oil, and then became the foundation of the European passive house movement that emerged from German and Swedish architectural research in the 1980s. The Passive House standard, now certified in tens of thousands of buildings across Europe and increasingly applied in North America, is built on exactly the principles Nora worked with on the Dakota hillside. Exploit stable earth temperatures rather than fighting against surface cold. Maximize the thermal mass of the building envelope so that heat absorbed is released slowly rather than instantly. Insulate to values that break the direct connection between outside temperature swings and inside temperature swings. Passive house buildings are required to consume less than 15 kilowatt-hours of heating energy per square meter of floor area per year, roughly 1/8 of what a well-built modern American frame house consumes, and a tiny fraction of what an 1,881 Dakota frame house was burning just to keep its occupants above freezing. The core insight of the Passive House movement, that the path to low energy use runs through thermal mass and earth coupling rather than through thicker and thicker insulation alone, is the same insight Nora arrived at by observation in 8 days. The terminology is different, the engineering precision is different. The outcome is the same, a structure that requires far less energy to maintain because it's working with the thermal inertia of the earth rather than against the thermal extremes of the surface air. Ground source heat pump technology, which now heats millions of American homes, works on a principle that would be immediately legible to anyone who spent February 1,881 inches, the Torgrimsen bluff shelter. Pipe loops buried 6 to 8 feet underground sit in soil that runs between 48 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, not because anything unusual is happening there, but because that's what the ground temperature is at that depth across most of the continental United States. The refrigerant in those pipes extracts that stable 50-degree temperature and uses it as a thermal base. In winter, the heat pump takes heat from the 50-degree ground and moves it into the house. It doesn't generate heat from fuel. It moves heat from one place to another, from the stable earth to the living space. For every 1 unit of electricity it consumes to run the compressor, it moves 3 to 4 units of usable heat from the ground into the house. The physics that makes this work is the same physics that made Nora's shelter work. The ground is warmer than the January air, and you can use that difference. She didn't have any of that language. She had a limestone hillside, and a glass thermometer, and a borrowed spade, and a letter with 9 days written into it. And she worked with what the land was actually telling her rather than what convention said a proper shelter was supposed to be. Cold air is heavy and it flows downhill on still nights and pools in low ground, and the person who builds a shelter in the valley bottom is building in the coldest air in the landscape, while the person who builds on a mid-slope above that pool builds in air that is 8 to 12 degrees warmer, for free, with no additional effort, because that is where the physics puts the warmth on a clear winter night. The ground below the frost line doesn't know what the weather is doing on the surface. It holds the warmth it absorbed in summer and releases it slowly through autumn and winter, and a structure built against that ground can draw on that released warmth the way a warm room draws on a fire, except the ground requires no fuel and doesn't go out. Snow on a flat surface stays where it falls, and 6 inches of dry Dakota snow is R6, and 2 feet of consolidated winter drift is R24. And the settler who peaked his roof sharply to shed the snow lost that insulation, while the sod roof that held the snow under its weight kept it. And by February, the drift above the bluff shelter was a better insulator than any material available for purchase in Brule County that winter. 3 physics principles working simultaneously, requiring nothing to purchase except the labor of digging and cutting and stacking what the hillside already contained. 3 families sheltered in what she built. Not one of them froze. Not one of them lost a finger or a toe to the cold. Nora Torgrimsen, 4 years old, spent February of 1,881 on a packed clay sleeping platform inside a limestone bluff in Dakota Territory, and came out of it without so much as a bad cough. Nora Torgrimsen, with the farmhouse and the barn and the full woodpile and the proper lumber structure, the one that announced seriousness and investment and a family's intention to stay, lost a milk cow and burned his fence rails and his barn siding and walked 2 miles through -20-degree air to knock on his daughter-in-law's stone wall and say he was wrong about the land. The 40 acres he'd given her as the worthless portion of the estate, the rocks, the creek, the slope nobody could plough, turned out to contain 3 things that no amount of money could buy in January of 1881. A south-facing limestone face that held the summer's heat into February, a mid-slope position above the creek bottom cold, and a flat surface for the winter's snow to accumulate and stay. She had $4.60 and 9 days, and it was enough.